Brookhaven, a small town on the Oregon coast, known for its leisurely pace and old-fashioned atmosphere, seemed like a place where time stood still. Its winding cobblestone streets and houses, many dating back to the turn of the last century, held the stories of generations. The air always smelled of salt and freshly baked goods from Jenny's Cafe on the corner of the main street. The people of the town were accustomed to the calm and quiet evenings filled with the sound of waves lapping against the shore. Harold Winters had been a part of this town for as long as its narrow streets. A World War II veteran, he stood out among the residents with his good-natured smile and bright eyes that glowed with vitality despite his age. He was in his mid-80s, but that didn't stop him from spending evenings on his front porch telling stories of his youth to passers-by. His voice, deep and warm, drew listeners, especially young people. Once, in the 45th, he would begin, and even those who were hearing the story for the 10th time would freeze, waiting for the details. He knew every corner of Brookhaven, every story and secret that its residents hid. Harold's neighbor, James Fletcher, was a man withdrawn and gloomy. He rarely left his house except to feed the birds in the backyard. Residents often whispered, wondering about his past and why he never mentioned his family. But Harold, knowing James from his youth, respected him for his silent devotion and love of silence. Tom Winters, Harold's grandson, was the complete opposite. Young, with burning ambition, studying law at the local university. Tom had grown up under Harold's wing after his parents died in a car accident. His grandfather was a mentor, friend, and stern counselor to him all in one. Tom loved his grandfather, but his youthful carelessness and confidence sometimes clashed with Harold's senile wisdom, and then short but heated arguments broke out between them. Emily Harper, Tom's girlfriend, had only recently moved to Brookhaven from Seattle. She was 23 years old, and there was always a slight sadness in her gaze, like people who are searching but haven't yet found their place in life. Emily worked at the local library and immediately fell in love with the place for its old wooden shelves, the smell of dust, and the rustle of pages. Brookhaven became her refuge from the hustle and bustle of the city. Her relationship with Tom was full of warm moments and innocent laughter. They often took walks along the shore, discussed future plans, and dreamed of Tom becoming a successful lawyer and Emily developing her rare book collection. But in recent months, something had changed. Tom noticed that Emily began to spend more time in the library than usual, even on weekends. Sometimes she avoided his gaze, her smile seemed strained. Harold became a frequent visitor to the library. He came for old books that reminded him of his youth and times when the world was different. Emily welcomed him, and soon conversations began between them. He told her about his days at the front, about how he had met sunsets on another continent in his youth, and about people who were long gone. Emily, absorbing his every word, realized that these stories were bringing something important to life in her, something she had been searching for so long. One day, when the library was about to close, Harold entered, holding an old book under his arm. Emily smiled at him, putting aside her notes. "Did you really need the same story again?" Her voice sounded soft and enveloping. Harold, without answering, looked into her eyes and said, "Sometimes old stories come back in circles and there's nothing we can do about it." There was a quiet sadness in his gaze and something else, elusive but persistent. Rumors spread quickly in small towns. Emily's friend, Laura, had noticed that her friend had become pensive, and even when Tom came into the library, it was as if his presence didn't touch Emily. "Are you okay, Amy?" Laura asked one day. Emily only nodded, but inwardly she was tormented by the feeling that she had crossed a line beyond which there would be no return. She tried not to look at Tom when they met eyes, her heart starting to pound too fast. Tom noticed the change, too. He saw Grandpa staying out longer than usual, Emily leaving the house earlier and returning later. One evening when Tom invited Emily to dinner, he couldn't help but ask a question that had long matured in his mind. "You've changed, Emily. What's going on? It's like you're drifting away from me." Emily lowered her gaze, her fingers nervously rubbing the edge of her napkin. "No, Tom. There's nothing wrong. It's just that sometimes I think about the past, about what I left behind in Seattle. Brookhaven has become my home, but I'm still adjusting." Her voice sounded confident, but there was an elusive tremor in it that alerted Tom. Meanwhile, Harold sat on his porch and gazed up at the stars. His thoughts were preoccupied with something quite different from what he was telling people. He realized that this moment, talking to Emily, her looks and fleeting smiles, was the last glimpse of his bygone youth, something he could never get back. And yet, he couldn't stop. One day, as evening descended on the town and the library emptied, Harold was the last visitor left. Emily was standing at the window, watching the slow flow of people outside, when she heard a quiet voice behind her say, "Have you ever wondered how stories become mysteries?" Harold stood beside her, his eyes glowing with understanding. "We choose what to do with those mysteries," she replied, trying not to give away the tremor in her voice. That moment was brief, but from it began a chain of events that would change the lives of many in Brookhaven. In the quiet evenings of Brookhaven, there was a special closeness between people who had lived side by side for years. Everyone knew their neighbors' stories, their habits and oddities. Harold Winters seemed to be part of this group, but in his heart he was gnawed by the loneliness that lingered after the death of his wife, Mary. She had been the light of his life, and her passing left a void that he tried to fill with memories and stories of his past. But memories, however warm their light, could not replace the living warmth of a human being. With each passing day, his meetings with Emily became more than just friendly conversations. Her sincere interest in his stories awakened in him a sense of youth and importance he had long since lost. He couldn't help but notice the gleam in her eyes when he talked about his adventures, about Mary, about the war. It wasn't love in the usual sense, but something deep, connecting two lonelinesses born among the pages of old books. Emily, for her part, grew more and more attached to these encounters. Her naivety and romantic nature pushed her toward Harold. He seemed to her not only a witness to the past, but also the keeper of secrets she wanted to unravel. They weren't just stories. They became a bridge connecting her present to something majestic and eternal. She felt calm in his presence, as if their conversations were a saving island in her life, filled with shadows of loneliness and memories of home in Seattle. But not everyone remained in the dark. Tom, who at first thought of the meetings as a simple friendship, gradually began to notice a change. Emily was leaving the house early, coming back later. Her smile when she was around him seemed a little strained. He tried to brush these thoughts away, writing them off as his own jealousy. Emily just got caught up in her work and the history of the town, he reassured himself, but there was a growing uneasiness in his soul. Sheriff Michael Rivers was an old friend of Harold's and often visited him to talk about the past and nostalgize about the old days. Michael was a man of word and honor and was respected for his fairness and firm character. One day, on his way home from a round of the town, he saw Harold and Emily leave the library together. It was unusual, but the sheriff only raised an eyebrow and continued on his way, deciding not to jump to conclusions. James Fletcher, Harold's neighbor, was always in the shadows of events. His shrewd eye and habit of observing what was going on made him an indispensable source of rumors. He had seen Emily and Harold sitting on an old bench in the park, having lively conversations, oblivious to the passage of time. They're together too often, James thought, but decided to keep quiet, not wanting to draw too much attention to himself. Emily often stayed late at the library, cataloging new editions. One day, as dusk was falling outside, the door opened and Harold entered the room. His face was focused but soft. Emily looked up and smiled. "Are you after the old books again?" she joked, setting the papers aside. "Yes, but not just for the books," Harold replied with a note of sadness in his voice. He sat down across from her, and for a moment silence hung in the room. "Emily, have you ever wondered why we are drawn to memories?" he asked suddenly. She nodded, her eyes full of questions. "Because they're the only thing we can keep when the rest is gone," he continued, and there was wisdom as well as pain in his words. Emily, touched by his words, felt her heart squeeze. She reached out to touch his palm, but quickly pulled it away, as if afraid to cross an invisible line. Meanwhile, Tom noticed more and more a spark running between them, invisible but tangible. He began to wonder why his grandfather visited the library so often, and why Emily was growing colder with him. One evening, he decided to stop by there unannounced and saw them having a conversation that seemed too personal. "Grandpa?" Tom's voice interrupted the silence. Harold and Emily flinched, turning around. "Tom, I just brought a book." Harold tried to remain calm, but his voice shook. Emily quickly turned away, gathering her papers, trying not to meet Tom's gaze. After the incident, Tom couldn't get the picture he had seen out of his mind. He tried to talk to Emily, but her answers became more and more detached. He felt that something was missing, something important was happening before his eyes, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Meanwhile, James Fletcher continued to watch from his window, drawing his own conclusions. And Sheriff Rivers was beginning to notice that Brookhaven's peace of mind was cracking at the seams. And soon, all these small details would culminate into something bigger, something that could change the lives of everyone involved. Brookhaven began to live on rumors that spread like the wind through the streets. At first, they were just whispers going from one pair of ears to another. Laura, Emily's friend, noticed her restlessness more and more often. Emily became withdrawn and silent, her eyes staring off into the distance as if she were trying to escape something unseen. Laura couldn't take it anymore, and one day she asked, "Amy, what's going on with you? It's like you're not here." Emily tried to smile, but her smile was barely visible. "Just too much work, Laura. Nothing serious," she replied, avoiding her friend's gaze. But Laura knew that was a lie. Her friend had changed too much lately. The tiredness in her eyes, the nervous movements, all told that something was troubling her. But what? Harold and Emily met more and more often on the outskirts of town, where an old forest hid them from view. Their conversations were full of memories and difficult confessions. Emily admired his history, and her fascination became an unexpected source of strength for Harold. They sat in a fallen tree, and Harold talked about his regrets. "I always thought I'd come back from war and life would be easier, but some battles stay inside us forever," he said bitterly. Emily listened to him without taking her eyes off him, and something clenched in her heart. She saw him not only as a veteran, but as a man full of hidden wounds that wouldn't heal over the years. But their secluded conversations did not go unnoticed. That evening, as the forest shrouded the city in its fog, a third person watched them. The branches of the trees whispered their secrets, and the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the forest. "Harold, we're not alone here," Emily whispered, struggling to control her excitement. Harold stood up, his face serious. "Who's here?" His voice was loud and firm, but all that was heard in response was the rustle of leaves. He happened to come across a note among Emily's papers in familiar handwriting, his grandfather's handwriting. "Memories pull us back, but only they remain true," the note said. The discovery left Tom speechless. Sheriff Michael Rivers was a man used to solving mysteries. He could feel the tension in the air and noticed the residents of Brookhaven beginning to whisper behind Harold and Emily's backs. One evening, he stopped Tom outside Jenny's cafe. "Tom, is everything all right? You look worried," he asked, scrutinizing the young man. Tom sighed, his eyes glittering with suspicion. "Michael, something's going on, but I don't understand what it is yet," he replied, struggling to contain his emotions. The sheriff frowned. "If you find out anything, let me know. We can't afford to have unrest in our town." Meanwhile, James Fletcher, Harold's neighbor, watched everything from his window. His discerning eyes had long since picked up on the strange things going on in Brookhaven. He had seen Harold and Emily hiding in the woods, Tom walking around his grandfather's house looking for something. "I wonder when someone will put it all together," muttered James, sipping his strong tea. No one had expected the end to come so suddenly. One morning, Tom, alarmed that Harold did not appear on the porch at his usual time, went to see him. The door was ajar. The grandson's heart sank. As he entered, he saw his grandfather's body lying on the floor. His face was calm, but the coldness emanating from it gave away the truth. The room was quiet, but something in that silence screamed injustice. Sheriff Rivers arrived on the scene almost immediately. His gaze lingered on the glass of water on the table. There were no visible signs of violence, but the details didn't add up. "We need to find out what happened," he said firmly to the assistant, who nodded silently. Laura, upon hearing of the tragedy, rushed to Emily. She found her in the library, where she stood staring at one point, as if she saw something beyond the reach of others. "Amy, did you know? Did you know what happened to Harold?" Laura could barely hold back her tears. Emily slowly turned her head, her eyes full of pain. "Laura, everything has changed. We're not going back to the way things were." Her voice shook but was full of determination. The town began to build theories. Some believed Harold had died his own death, while others whispered of poison and old sins. Brookhaven seemed to be torn apart under the weight of its own mysteries. Sheriff Rivers' gaze increasingly focused on those who were hiding the truth, and he realized there was more to uncover than one suspicious incident. Anxiety reigned in the town, and Brookhaven was no longer the same. Sheriff Michael Rivers realized that Harold Winters' death was no accident. At first glance, it looked simple. An elderly man found dead in his home with no signs of violence, but something about the picture didn't seem right, and Rivers couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing an important detail. An examination of the scene began by analyzing the contents of a water glass found on the table next to the body. Laboratory tests showed that the water contained a poison carefully disguised as an ordinary substance. It was a rare substance that was not easy to obtain, and that only increased suspicion. The first interrogations began at once. Tom, Harold's grandson, was in shock and could not believe that his grandfather could have been murdered. He stood on the threshold of the sheriff's office, clenching his fists and staring into the void. "Tom, I understand how hard this is for you right now," Rivers began, trying to keep his composure. "But we need to talk. Have you noticed anything strange in recent weeks?" Tom looked up slowly, and his eyes read a mixture of rage and pain. "Yeah, I've been finding notes left by Emily. I didn't realize they were communicating so closely," he admitted, struggling to find the words. "But Grandpa would never do anything wrong. Emily, she was important to him." Emily's name rang through the room like a stroke of thunder. The sheriff held his gaze on Tom, realizing he needed to talk to the girl. Emily Harper had been called in for questioning. She entered the office, her face pale, her hands trembling. Rivers noticed how she struggled to contain herself but held herself with dignity. "Emily, please tell us about your relationship with Harold Winters," the sheriff began, trying to speak as softly as possible. Emily swallowed and looked directly into the sheriff's eyes. We talked a lot. He talked about his past, things that troubled him. We became friends, but nothing more. He was like a mentor to me." Her voice shook, but sounded sincere. Rivers nodded, but his gaze remained focused. "Then, explain why your handwriting appeared on the note found at Tom's place. It mentioned some secrets," he continued, watching her reaction. Emily turned even paler, her hands clenched into fists. "It was just part of our correspondence. Harold often shared his thoughts, and I responded to him. Nothing criminal." She fell silent, looking around as if seeking support. Rivers remained silent, pondering her words. His attention was drawn to the diary they'd found in Harold's house. It contained conversations with Emily and references to something that had been bothering him in recent months. Meanwhile, James Fletcher, always the observant neighbor, decided to report to the station with new information. He told the sheriff what he had seen that night when Harold and Emily had met in the woods and how someone had been sneaking up behind them in the shadows. "I don't know who it was, but it certainly wasn't Tom," James said, his voice strained. "Probably someone from the town who didn't like their friendship." This information made Rivers think. The town that seemed so quiet and friendly hid deep-seated resentments and secrets. He realized that if he didn't act quickly, the situation could become explosive. The sheriff decided to go back to the lab data and trace the source of the poison. It soon became clear that the substance had been ordered from a drugstore in a neighboring town under a false name. This discovery was the first real lead that could take the investigation to the next level. Rivers assembled a team and began checking out everyone who had access to such a substance. Tom, torn by rage and doubt, couldn't let what had happened go unchecked. He became increasingly suspicious of Emily, despite her assurances of innocence. One evening, he decided to go to her house and find out once and for all. Emily opened the door, her face reflecting a mixture of fear and fatigue. "Why didn't you tell me you had such a close relationship with your grandfather?" Tom began bitterly, Emily covered her face with her hands and sat back in her chair. Tom? It's not what you think. I never wished him harm. I cared for him. But then why the secret notes? Why the hiding if it was all so innocent? His voice shook with emotion. Emily looked at him with despair. Harold told me things he never told anyone else. It was part of his past that he shared to find peace. He knew some of the residents wouldn't want to remember these events. Soon more rumors began to surface. Some claimed that Harold knew something important about some of the influential people of the town. Others believed that he had enemies that he didn't tell anyone about. Neighbors whispered, discussing secret meetings and mysterious incidents that had occurred over the past months. A dark cloud of suspicion and fear hung over the town, threatening to disturb its fragile peace. James Fletcher came to the sheriff's office again with a new detail. He remembered hearing a voice that night as he watched the woods that sounded familiar, but he couldn't pinpoint it. It could have been anyone, Michael, he said, looking the sheriff in the eye. But I'm sure this man is connected to Harold's past. I heard him speak of duty and justice, but I couldn't figure out who it was. The sheriff realized that every day of procrastination was bringing the town closer to chaos. He needed to act quickly, while the evidence was still fresh and suspicion hadn't turned to hysteria. He was going to call in additional experts and deepen the investigation that had become a matter of honor. Rivers' office received another unexpected call. The voice on the other end of the line was hoarse and frightened. "Sheriff, I know who did this," the voice began. It was Martin Randolph, Harold's old army comrade who had recently returned to Brookhaven. His voice trembled, and Rivers felt something inside him tense up. "Martin? What do you mean?" the sheriff asked, trying to remain calm. "I saw him, the one who was buying poison at the pharmacy in the neighboring town. I wasn't sure if I should tell you, but now I realize it's necessary," Randolph continued. His words sounded hurried, like a man anxious to unburden himself. Rivers frowned, realizing the significance of this confession. "Who was it, Martin? Can you describe him?" Silence hung on the line. Then Randolph sighed heavily. "It was someone who served with Harold. Someone everyone thought was long gone. I'll tell everything in person, but this is about events no one wants to remember." The next day, Martin Randolph arrived at the station. Sheriff Rivers invited him into his office and, closing the door, looked intently at his old acquaintance. Martin's face was drained, his eyes glittering with fatigue and exertion. "Michael, I've been hesitant to speak for a long time, but after everything that's happened, I can't keep quiet any longer," he began, rubbing his hands together. "Harold and I served together, but there were things in the army that he preferred not to bring up. One man, Jackson Rivers, was among us. He always thought Harold betrayed him when he didn't support his plan, which could have ended in tragedy." The sheriff frowned. The name Jackson Rivers was familiar to him, but the man had long ago left town and was rumored to be leading an isolated life in a neighboring county. "You mean Jackson's back?" Rivers asked, trying to hide his excitement. Martin nodded. "I saw him when I was buying medicine at the drugstore. He avoided eye contact and seemed worried, but I'm sure it was him." Rivers realized that the missing threads were finally beginning to weave themselves into a coherent pattern. Now, the only thing left to do was to find Jackson and find out what had brought him back to Brookhaven. Sheriff Rivers had assembled a small task force to track down Jackson Rivers and question him. A hunch never left Michael. If Martin was right, Jackson could be the key to the whole mystery surrounding Harold's death. Meanwhile, rumors of the investigation continued to spread through the town. Residents began to glance around anxiously, discussing the possible return of Jackson, a man many knew as a vague figure with a dark past. Tom and Emily felt the tension too. Tom, who had already faced the realization more than once that there was much he didn't know about his family's past, now had even more questions. A few hours later, the sheriff's team hit the trail. They discovered that Jackson was indeed renting a small cabin outside of town where there had once been an abandoned sawmill. The sheriff and his deputies went there at sunset when the shadows were beginning to thicken, and a cool breeze brought with it the smell of wet wood. As they approached the cabin, they noticed light shining through the cracks in the old shutters. Rivers gestured to his men to stay alert. He went to the door and knocked, noticing the muffled sounds inside. The door creaked open and Jackson stood before the sheriff, a tall man with graying temples and tired eyes. He looked like he knew this moment would come sooner or later. "Michael didn't expect to see you here," he said hoarsely, stepping aside for the sheriff and his men to enter. Rivers looked around the room. The desk was littered with papers and old photographs, and war maps hung on the wall. "Jackson, we need to talk about Harold Winters," the sheriff began, watching carefully for his interlocutor's reaction. Jackson flinched, but didn't look surprised. He sat down tiredly at the table and reached out for a glass of water, but then, as if changing his mind, pushed it aside. "So you've come for answers," he said, lowering his head. "I knew this was coming as soon as I heard of his death. Harold wasn't as simple as he seemed." Jackson looked at the sheriff, his eyes expressing a mixture of sorrow and relief. He sighed and continued. "Harold and I were bound together not only by our army past, but by a secret that only a few people knew about in the war. When things didn't go according to plan, Harold made a decision that saved many, but left me and a few others in the shadow of his glory. I held a grudge. But that wasn't it. In his final years, he began to seek redemption by revealing a secret he swore to keep for the rest of his life." Sheriff Rivers listened tensely, going over the variations of possible motives. He was already realizing that Jackson wasn't just a bystander or a man with a grudge. There was more to it than that. "Harold said he was going to publicize an old story about what we did to one of our comrades at the front," Jackson continued, his voice trembling. "That story had the potential to ruin lives, and some of his old friends found out about his intentions." Rivers frowned, fragments beginning to form in his mind. If Harold really did plan to tell the truth, it could explain why someone from his past wanted to silence him. But who exactly? And was Jackson just a witness, or was he himself involved? "Jackson, I need to know who else knew about Harold's plans," the sheriff asked, his gaze piercing. Jackson averted his eyes as if struggling with himself, but then spoke quietly. "Martin Randolph and a couple other men, but one of us had a real reason to stop him." At that moment, a deputy entered the cabin, interrupting the conversation. "Michael, you need to see this. We found a letter at Martin's house that talks about meeting Harold the night he died." The sheriff felt the tension in the room rise. The puzzle was beginning to come together, but there were still pieces left unfilled. Sheriff Rivers picked up the letter the deputy held out to him. The paper was old and slightly ragged, with uneven but confident lines. He ran his eyes over the text quickly, and each word made his heart beat faster. "Harold, this can't go on. I know what you have decided to do, and we both realize the consequences could be disastrous. We must meet and discuss this. You know where to find me. Don't let us all down." Asterisk. There was no signature, but the sheriff had no doubt. This letter belonged to Martin Randolph. It was clear now that he and Harold had met on the night of his death. Rivers glanced at Jackson, who now sat with his shoulders slumped, as if he were under an exorbitant weight. "What do you know about Harold and Martin's meeting?" the sheriff asked with pressure. Jackson exhaled quietly and replied, "Martin knew the most about Harold's past. They were close and had been through a lot together. If anyone could have tried to stop him, it was Martin. But he's not the killer, or at least I thought he was." At this point, it became clear to the sheriff that he needed to question Martin as soon as possible. He gave orders to his men to find and bring him to the station. Time was playing against them, and every hour of delay could mean the loss of an important piece of evidence, or a chance to uncover the true culprit. A few hours later, Martin Randolph was found in his home near the center of town. He looked troubled, his hands shaking as he was led to the sheriff's office. Silence settled in Rivers' office, broken only by the ticking of the clock. "Martin, we have evidence that you were the last person to see Harold alive. Tell us what happened that night," the sheriff began, his voice firm but not angry. Martin looked up, eyes full of despair. "I tried to stop him, Michael. We had a fight. He said he couldn't hide the truth any longer, that he needed to be free of the past. I begged him to think of those who would be hurt by it, but I didn't kill him. When I left, he was alive." Martin's words hung in the air, and the sheriff needed to figure out if he was telling the truth, or if this was just part of an elaborate game in which the truth was hidden behind fear and lies. Sheriff Rivers scrutinized Martin, who sat across from him. He was trying to match the new details with what he already knew. "Martin, you said Harold was going to reveal some backstory. Why did you think it had to do with his recent visits to Emily?" Rivers asked, frowning his eyebrows. Martin sighed and ran a hand over his face. "It all started a few weeks ago when I received a letter from an old Army comrade. It mentioned that Harold was in contact with a journalist who was interested in events at the front. I started following him and noticed him meeting with Emily, visiting the library. Then I heard him telling her it was time to atone for old sins, that he couldn't live with the secret anymore." The sheriff clenched his jaws, realizing that the old events of the war and Harold's new romance were intertwined into one tangle. "So his decision to tell the truth was a surprise to you?" Rivers clarified. "Not just for me," Martin replied. "For Jackson, it became a threat. He knew that if Harold revealed what had happened at the front, it would ruin everything he was trying to preserve." Rivers frowned even more. He now realized that Harold's connection with Emily had been the final push that had made him decide to make the revelation. Several key figures were gathered in Sheriff Rivers' office: Tom, Emily, James Fletcher, and Martin Randolph. The atmosphere was so tense that the air in the room seemed to thicken every glance. Every movement was monitored with scrutiny. The sheriff took a deep breath and began to speak. "We have gathered enough evidence to uncover the truth of what happened the night Harold Winters died. Each of your testimonies, each piece of the story has added up to a bigger picture," Rivers began, his eyes glittering with fatigue and determination. He shifted his gaze to Emily, and she flinched involuntarily. "You were the catalyst for events that began to unfold long before you met Harold. He saw you as a reminder of his youth and something he couldn't get back, a second love, a feeling that came alive against all odds." Emily, hearing this, felt her heart clench. Tears came to her eyes, and she lowered her head to hide her emotions. Tom clenched his fists, his face expressing pain, frustration, and incomprehension. He stared at the sheriff as if waiting for an answer to the question that had plagued him from the beginning. "But you weren't the one involved in his death," Rivers continued. He turned to Martin. "Martin, you knew that Harold was going to reveal the truth about the events that took place in the war. But there was another man for whom revealing that truth would have been a disaster." Martin tensed, his gaze darting around the room. "Yes, I knew he wanted to tell the truth. Harold believed that as long as this secret remained hidden, he would find no peace. But I didn't know it would go this far." His voice trembled and he turned away. At that moment, the door of the study opened, and Jackson Rivers entered. His face was grim, and his eyes read pain. The sheriff looked surprised, but gestured for him to sit down. "Yes, Michael," Jackson began hoarsely, breaking the silence. "It was me, but I didn't mean to kill him. Things got out of hand." He sighed heavily and continued. "I found out that Harold had found a new happiness, that he was in touch with Emily and felt like he was living again. I thought he had lost his head. But then I realized he was going to tell everyone about our mistake at the front. It could have ruined everything I was trying to keep." Jackson looked at everyone, his voice trembling with tension. "When I received a letter from our old comrade mentioning that Harold was sharing his memories with someone and meeting with a journalist, I suspected the worst. I started following him and saw him spending time with Emily, telling her about the past. In one of our last meetings, he bluntly told me he was going to reveal everything." Jackson closed his eyes, remembering that night. The sheriff raised his eyebrows, his heart sinking. "And what happened that night?" "I went to Harold's house to talk him into stopping. We argued. He talked about how he had to atone, that he couldn't live with the burden any longer. He claimed that revealing the truth would help many, including himself, finally find peace. I poured him water to calm him down, and in a moment of rage, added the poison. That should have stopped him." Jackson turned away, his hands shaking. The silence that followed his confession was deafening. Tom, standing in the corner, clenched his fists even tighter, his face reddening with tension. "You killed him for fear of your reputation," Tom uttered, his voice trembling, and Grandpa just wanted to be honest. Tears came to his eyes, but he held them back. Emily covered her face with her hands, and tears ran down her cheeks. This wasn't just a shock to her, it was the shattering of everything she knew about Harold and her place in this story. Sheriff Rivers walked over to Jackson and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You should have come clean sooner, Jackson. The truth always comes out no matter how hard we try to hide it." His voice was full of fatigue, but sounded firm. Later that day, Jackson was arrested. In his testimony, he confirmed that he acted in fear and panic when he saw how Harold had regained the meaning of life and was about to reveal an old secret that could destroy the destinies of many. Tom was making sense of what had happened, sitting on the porch of the house where he and his grandfather had once discussed his future. Everything seemed empty and alien. Emily had made the decision to leave town to start a new life, leaving behind the shadow of this terrible event. She knew that Brookhaven would no longer be home for her. Brookhaven had returned to its quiet existence, but already with an altered perception of trust and memory. The town was no longer a place where old wounds and mistakes could be hidden without fear of them resurfacing. The inhabitants now knew that every secret sooner or later comes to light, and the price for hiding it could be too high.